Clara Bunch was setting a tray down at 4 p.m. when the room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't a noise, it was a shift in the gravity of the café. Vulture heavy. She didn't have to look up to know the air had just been sucked out of the room. Jeju didn't just walk through a door, he annexed the space. Impeccable charcoal suit, eyes like frozen glass, and a presence that made the soft jazz in the background sound like a funeral march. He moved to the counter with the slow, terrifying patience of a man who has never been told no, leaning in just close enough for Clara to smell the expensive cologne and the even more expensive arrogance. Then he spoke. He didn't use English or even the standard Korean heard on the bustling streets outside. He went deep, pulling out Jeju, a rough, ancient island dialect that sounds more like crashing waves than conversation. He used the words like a garrote, whispering to his associate that Clara was useless, a mere fixture in a room she didn't belong in. His smirk was a victory lap for a race he thought she didn't even know she was running. Clara's hand tightened around the edge of her tray until her knuckles turned white, but her face remained a mask of granite. What she did next didn't involve a weapon, but it hit Jeju harder than a physical blow. She reached for her ringing phone, looked him dead in the eye and answered in a Korean so fluent, so sharp and so melodious that the entire cafe went tomb silent. Now you have to understand something before this goes any further. Clara Bunch wasn't just some girl behind a counter. She was a survivor of a different kind of war. 3 years ago she had a life and soul, a career, a home and a name that meant something. Then the world was torched. Fabricated evidence, a legacy turned to ash, and a mother who needed her more than Clara needed her own pride. She chose this obscurity. She built this quiet life like a trench, one shift at a time, hiding behind an apron in a shop that smelled of roasted beans and hard-won peace. This was her sanctuary, a place where the shadows of her past couldn't find her. But the world has a way of bringing monsters to your doorstep. Jeju came looking for an easy target to bleed his frustrations onto, a way to feel powerful while his own corporate empire began to show cracks. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that the useless waitress he just tried to bury was the only person in this hemisphere who actually understood the man behind the mask. He thought he came to humiliate her. He had no idea he had just walked into the only room on earth where his power meant absolutely nothing. You've scrolled past 1,000 stories today. You stopped for this one. That's not a coincidence. If you've ever been looked down upon by someone who thought they held the world in their hands, if you've ever carried a secret strength while the world called you less, then you know Clara's story isn't just a script. It's a reckoning. Don't turn away now, because the moment the untouchable boss realizes he's the one who's truly small is a moment you don't want to miss. Clara Bunch moved through the morning like a shadow through a cathedral, present but never truly seen. Her world was a calculated performance of the mundane, a fortress built from the steam of espresso machines and the rhythmic clink of ceramic on wood. Every morning at the stroke of 6 she would flip the sign, the deadbolt's metallic snap echoing in the empty shop like a soldier chambering a round. It was a ritual of survival, a system designed to keep the murky of soul at bay and the prying eyes of the present diverted. To the regulars who drifted in for their morning caffeine, she was a fixture of the architecture, as unremarkable and reliable as the creaky third floorboard near the entrance. She had perfected the art of the porcelain mask. When a hurried businessman snapped his fingers at her as if she were a stray dog, or when a socialite left a damp, crumpled bill on the counter without a word of thanks, Clara felt the sting, but she never let it reach the surface. She absorbed the subtle disrespect, the casual dismissals, and the way people spoke over her as if she were deaf. She funneled that friction into the meticulous wipe of a counter or the precise alignment of a pastry display, turning their arrogance into her own quiet armor. Invisibility wasn't a prison, it was a tactical choice. Behind that counter she was a woman living a double life in the light of day. While she steamed milk, her mind traced the complex syntax of the Korean she had mastered in the shadows, the deep regional dialects she'd studied like a scholar preparing for a war of words. Every dismissive glance from a customer was just more data, more confirmation that the world only sees what it expects to see. She took care of her mother in a cramped apartment that smelled of sesame oil and ancient memories, a sanctuary she defended with every hour of her useless labor. She knew the exact weight of the silence that settled over the cafe at mid-afternoon, a heavy, keenly peace that she had built one unremarkable day at a time. It was her territory, her trench, and she was the commander of a landscape no one else bothered to map. She endured the smallness of her role because she knew the truth. Those who are overlooked are the only ones who truly see everything. She was waiting, though she didn't know for what, keeping her head down and her dignity held tight like a concealed weapon, until the day the air finally changed. Jeju lived in a world where mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford and silence was the only language that didn't betray you. His life wasn't a career. It was a siege, a cold, calculated climb up a mountain made of glass and rough steel. For 15 years he had been the architect of his own isolation, building a corporate syndicate that ran on the fumes of fear and the absolute certainty of his control. He was a man who moved without rushing because he owned the clock. A wolf who had learned early on that in the concrete jungle of Seoul's elite, you were either the one holding the blade or the one feeling the edge. His authority wasn't just in the tailored lines of his black suits or the silver rings that caught the light like industrial teeth. It was in the way he looked at a room and saw only assets and liabilities, never people. The dragon tattoo crawling up his neck was a reminder of the skin he'd had to shed to become the untouchable. He had spent a decade fighting into rooms that were locked to men like him, only to find that the air at the top was thin and bitter. Every alliance was a transaction. Every smile was a tactical maneuver. But even a fortress has cracks. This week the air had turned foul. The media was a pack of wolves, tearing at his reputation with a paper trail so clean it could only have been forged by a shadow. His business partners had gone quiet, their phones ringing into a void that smelled like a setup. He could feel the eyes of his own enforcers shifting, looking for the moment the alpha stumbled. The burden of the syndicate, the weight of every soul he'd stepped on to get here, was finally pressing down, a deadline looming like a gallows at the end of the week. He didn't come to the cafe for coffee, he came to find someone smaller than himself so he could remember what it felt like to be a giant. He needed to remind the world and perhaps his own reflection, that he was still the one who dictated the terms. He used his dialect, that sharp ancient Jeju tongue, as a reminder of the secrets he held and the culture he thought he'd conquered. He sat there, a man whose life was built on a foundation of control, unaware that he was about to collide with the only truth he couldn't manipulate. The steam from the espresso machine rose like a white flag of surrender, but Jeju wasn't looking for peace. He was looking for a breach. He leaned back in the narrow wooden chair, his presence a sharp blade cutting through the cafe's carefully curated warmth. Opposite him sat his associate, a man whose silence was bought with the kind of loyalty that only grows in the shade of a hunter. Jay didn't lower his voice. He simply changed the frequency, shifting into the low, guttural cadence of Jeju, the Jeju dialect that sounded like stones grinding in the surf of a forgotten coast. He watched Clara move, her back turned as she polished a glass with the rhythmic, dead-eyed focus of the condemned. "Do you know why I use this tongue?" Jay murmured in the rare dialect, the words catching in his throat like a secret. His associate remained a statue, but Jay continued, his eyes locked on the girl's unsuspecting shoulders. He explained that a language spoken by fewer than 10,000 souls wasn't just a way to communicate. It was a fortress with no doors. It was a tactical dead zone where a man could plan a murder or dismantle a soul while the world watched and understood nothing. To Jay, the Jeju dialect was the ultimate high ground, a linguistic artifact he'd excavated from the dirt to ensure he was never truly overheard. It allowed him to strip away the ordinary performance of the room and speak the ugly truth without consequence. He told his associate that people like the girl behind the counter were just background noise in the symphony of his life, furniture that didn't need to know the price of its own wood. He called her useless in the ancient tongue, a sharp, cold syllable that he was certain would slide off her back like rain off a stone. He used the dialect as a reminder of his own elevation, a code that separated the architects of power from the casualties of progress. He sat there, draped in the arrogance of a man who believed he held a weapon no one else could even see, let alone disarm. He relished the safety of the sound, the way the ancient syllables allowed him to casually humiliate a stranger while maintaining the polished mask of a gentleman. He was convinced that in this cramped little shop, he was the only one who truly spoke the language of the island, never realizing that the silence from the counter wasn't ignorance. It was a fuse, burning slow and steady toward the center of his world. The steam from the two Americanos rose in a twin spiral, a white shroud for the words Jeju had just buried in the air. Clara Bunch approached the table with the measured, lethal grace of a dusk walking through its own crime scene. She could feel the vibration of the Jeju dialect in her marrow, the Juyo syllables he used like a serrated edge to call her useless. It was a sound from a home she had been forced to burn, a linguistic artifact that Jay wore like a stolen crown. As she leaned down to set the first cup onto the dark wood, Jay didn't even break his gaze with his associate. He looked through her as if she were made of glass and old shadows. People like her shouldn't be in places like this, he murmured in that ancient, rough tongue, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who believes he is speaking in a vacuum. Clara's hand tightened around the edge of the circular tray until the metal bit into her palm, a sharp, grounding pain that kept her soul from screaming. She felt the heat of the ceramic through her skin, a slow burn that matched the cold fire spreading behind her ribs. She had the training to dismantle him in that same tongue, to conjugate his arrogance into a plea for mercy, but she didn't move. She chose silence. She built it around herself like a fortress, brick by unremarkable brick, just as she had for 3 years. To react was to give him the satisfaction of a target. To remain still was to become the terrain he would eventually trip over. She set the second cup down with a click so precise it sounded like a clock ticking toward zero. Jay's smirk was a sharp line of victory, a hawk convinced he had just marked his territory without a single witness. He didn't see the way her eyes, though fixed on the table, held the depth of a deep-sea trench. He didn't notice the slight rhythmic heave of her chest as she mastered her breathing, turning her anger into a quiet, sharp utility. Clara straightened her apron, her face a mask of granite, and turned back toward the counter. She had heard every syllable, every inflection of his disdain, and she filed it away in the notebooks of her mind. He thought he was trapping her in his secret language, but in that cramped shop that smelled of sesame oil and survival, he had just handed her the only weapon she needed. She walked away, the third floorboard creaking beneath her feet, a silent commander waiting for the air to change. The tension in the café was a taut wire, vibrating with the unspoken weight of Jae Doohan's disdain. Clara Bunch stood behind the wooden counter, her back a wall of silent defiance as she reclaimed her cloth. Jay leaned back, his smirk a sharp scar of victory in a language he believed was a tomb. Then the silence shattered. The sharp, digital trill of a smartphone sliced through the low hum of the espresso machine and the soft jazz. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the device tucked beside the register. She glanced at the screen and for the first time, the granite mask of the unremarkable shopkeeper cracked. She answered. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. Clara's voice didn't rise, but it carried the authority of a bell tolling in a deep canyon. She wasn't speaking English. She was speaking Korean, not the rough, fragmented version expected of a stranger, but a dialect so fluid, so melodic, and so hauntingly precise that it felt like a shadow had taken breath. Yes, Mama. I'm fine. Don't worry, she said softly, the syllables of the high humble form rolling off her tongue with the effortless grace of someone born to the language. Her voice was a low tide, steady and full of a weary, protective love. I'll be home soon. Just keep the tea warm. The effect was cataclysmic. Across the small space, the porcelain cup in Jae Doohan's hand stopped mid-air. The two enforcers behind him shifted, their professional poise dissolving into a frantic internal buffering. Jae's eyes, previously cold and bored, dilated until they were dark pits of shock. The useless fixture, the woman he had just casually dismantled in a secret tongue, was speaking his own heart back to him. The air in the shop changed again, turning from voracious to paralyzed. As Clara disconnected the call, she didn't look away. She turned, her steady, unreadable gaze locking onto Jay's frozen expression. The silence that followed was no longer her fortress. It was his cage. Every ugly word he had whispered in Jeju now hung in the amber light between them, stripped of its cover, raw and damning. For the first time in his life of calculated control, the wolf realized he wasn't looking at a shopkeeper. He was looking at a mirror, and the reflection was terrifying. The silence that followed Clara's phone call was a physical weight, a sharp blade of truth hanging in the amber light of the café. Jae Doohan sat paralyzed, the porcelain cup in his hand trembling ever so slightly as the steam from his Americano became a ghostly shroud for his own arrogance. His world, a fortress built on the absolute certainty of his own superiority, didn't just crack. It tilted on its axis. The woman he had just casually dismantled in the secret tongue of Jeju wasn't a fixture. She was a witness. He replayed the syllables of his own disdain in his head, each word now a hot coal in his throat. Useless. A thing that doesn't belong. He had used his dialect as a weapon, a hunter marking a territory he thought was empty, only to find he had been standing in the center of her crosshairs the entire time. His expression, once a mask of bored authority, dissolved into a raw, frantic shock. For the first time in 15 years of corporate warfare and syndicate blood, Jeju felt small. Not because of a loss of power but because of a sudden violent injection of humanity. Clara set her phone down on the wooden counter with a click that sounded like a hammer falling on an empty chamber. She didn't look away. Her eyes, steady as still water and twice as deep, held his gaze without a flicker of the smallness he had tried to project onto her. She stood behind her apron like a commander in a trench, her dignity a silent, unyielding force that made his charcoal suit and silver rings look like a child's costume. The enforcers behind Jay shifted, their brain-buffering silence a testament to the collapse of the hierarchy they lived by. Jay looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see an asset or a liability. He saw a person he had deeply, casually hurt. The wolf's smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow, keen realization that the only person in this room who truly understood him was the one he had tried to bury. The café, with its hand-lettered tags and leaning shelves, had become a court of public opinion with a jury of one. He sat in the wreckage of his own pride, the silence echoing with the soft, lethal precision of her Korean voice, waiting for the ground to stop shaking. Clara's gaze didn't waver, but her mind drifted back 3 years to a soul that burned with a different kind of fire. Before the apron and the cramped grocery store, she had lived a real life. One with a name that commanded respect and a career built in rooms that kept their doors locked to those like her. She had been undeniably good at what she did, a rising force in a landscape of steel and glass. But the higher you climb, the more targets you wear on your back. The collapse had been surgical. Overnight, a paper trail appeared, documents and screenshots so perfectly damning that they silenced her closest allies. It was a lie built with forensic patience, designed to look like she had betrayed everything she stood for. People she had known for a decade stopped returning her calls, and her reputation, the thing she had spent a lifetime tempering, became a punchline. Amidst the wreckage of her career, there was the quiet, steady heartbeat of her mother. As the media dismantled Clara's name, her mother's health began to fail, a slow fading that required a strength Clara didn't know she possessed. She became a caretaker in the shadows of a city that had turned its back on her, a woman fighting 2 wars at once, one for her mother's survival and one against a lie she couldn't outrun. She never found out who exactly had orchestrated the hit, but she saw the structure of it, the way evidence was curated and timelines were shaped to point only at her. When the pressure became a physical weight, she chose to disappear. She traded her old life for a lease on a tired shop and a system of routine that meant invisibility. She moved to a neighborhood where no one asked questions, a place that smelled of sesame oil and the cold, hard necessity of survival. She had channeled her anger into linguistic archaeology, learning the deep regional dialects and historical syntax of Korea as a way to stay sharp in a world that wanted her dull. She had built her shop like a fortress, one unremarkable day at a time, waiting for the right piece to fall into place. She had lived in the quiet for 3 years, a shadow in a foreign place, holding onto her dignity like a concealed weapon. Now, looking at Jeju-han's shattered expression, she realized the past was no longer just a memory. It was the map she would use to lead them both out of the dark. The silence in the shop was a keen, airless vacuum that made the buzzing of the overhead light sound like a serrated blade. Jeju-han sat paralyzed, the porcelain cup in his hand trembling as the steam became a creepy shroud for his own arrogance. He replayed the syllables of his own disdain in his head, each word now a hot coal in his throat. Useless. A thing that doesn't belong. He had used the Jeju dialect as a weapon, a marauder marking a territory he thought was empty, only to find he had been standing in the center of her crosshairs the entire time. For the first time in 15 years of corporate warfare and syndicate blood, the powerful boss felt small, not because of a loss of territory but because of a sudden violent injection of truth. The dragon tattoo on his neck, once a symbol of his ascent, now felt like a heavy chain of the man he had become. He looked at the hand-lettered price tags and the leaning shelves, realizing that this cramped space held more dignity than his entire empire. His expression, once a mask of bored authority, dissolved into the raw, frantic shock of a man who realized he had just dismantled his own soul in front of a witness. He had lived a life built on control, believing that language was a trap he could set for others, never imagining the weapon could be taken from him mid-swing. The untouchable reputation he had carried into the room was a lie that had finally burned out. Clara stood behind her apron like a commander in a trench, her steady, unreadable gaze locking him in place. The silence between them was no longer his sanctuary. It was a mirror reflecting the hawk's wreckage. In the quiet that smelled of sesame oil and survival, Jeju understood that his power was a shadow and the woman he had dismissed as invisible was the only one who truly saw him. He sat in the narrow corner of the grocery store, a man who had everything finally realizing he had nothing at all. The amber glow of the single overhead lamp seemed to shrink, pulling the shadows of the grocery store tighter around the counter as Jeju finally pushed back his chair. The heavy, sharp silence was broken only by the rhythmic, low-tide breathing of a man who had just seen his own reflection and found it wanting. He moved toward the counter, but the extreme grace was gone, replaced by the uncertain heavy step of a soldier walking through a minefield of his own making. He stopped before the worn wooden surface where Clara Bunch stood, her hands flat and steady, her face a mask of granite that had weathered far worse storms than him. He didn't lean over the counter this time. He stood back, his tailored suit suddenly feeling like a shroud. His voice, when it finally came, was stripped of its weaponized edge, a hollow rasp that barely carried across the stacks of seaweed and sesame crackers. "You understood, didn't you?" he managed, the words catching in a throat that had only known the taste of command. It wasn't a question of linguistics, but a confession of a soul caught in the open. He waited, the silver rings on his fingers catching the light as he braced for the strike he knew he deserved. Clara didn't quail. She tilted her head with a direct, steady gaze that felt like still water, calm, deep, and utterly unafraid. She didn't reach for the anger she had channeled into her studies for 3 long years. Instead, she reached for a truth that cut deeper than any blade. "Words matter," she said gently, her voice filling the cramped sanctuary with a weight that made the high-status businessman feel smaller than the hand-lettered price tags on her shelves. "Even when you think no one hears. Especially then." The confrontation was silent, a collision of 2 worlds where the one with the most to lose had already let go. Jay stood there, the arrogance knocked out of him, looking at the woman he had dismissed as invisible. In that moment, the untouchable boss didn't see a shopkeeper. He saw a person who had survived a war he was only just beginning to understand. He had come to trap her, but as he stared at the woman in the apron, he realized she was the only one in the room who was truly free. The silence that followed was no longer a cage. It was the first safe thing he had touched in years. The bell above the door rang with a finality that seemed to echo long after Jeju stepped out into the night air. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a charcoal suit that suddenly felt like a leaden shroud. The city moved around him in a blurred rush of neon and noise, indifferent to the fact that his entire world had just collapsed in the corner of a cramped grocery store. For 15 years he had been the architect of a syndicate built on the absolute certainty of his control, but as he looked at the silver rings catching the streetlights, he realized he was standing on hollow ground. He climbed into the back of his car, where his associate sat in a silence that had once felt like professional loyalty but now tasted like the cold vacuum of an empty life. Jay didn't look at the man, he stared at his own reflection in the darkened window, seeing a wolfish who had finally run out of prey. "I've forgotten how to be human," he murmured, the words rasping in a throat that had only known the sharp edges of command. He realized that in his climb to become the untouchable, he had systematically torched every bridge that led to a real connection. The burden of the syndicate, the weight of every soul he had stepped on and every lie he had used as a blade, was finally pressing down with the cold clarity of a gallows. He had used a rare dialect to build a fortress of secrecy, only to find that the only person who truly understood the wreckage of his soul was a woman he had dismissed as invisible. His life was a meticulously curated paper trail of power and intimidation, but it lacked the steady, quiet dignity he had felt in the shop that smelled of sesame oil and survival. He thought of Clara Bunch, standing behind her counter with the calm of a commander who had already made her peace with the war. She had lost everything and started over with nothing but her name and an apron, yet she possessed a strength that his money and enforcers could never buy. Jay closed his eyes, the arrogance finally dissolving into a raw, rough vulnerability. He was a man who owned the room but had no home, an architect of influence who had become a prisoner of his own reputation. For the first time in his criminal career, the beast understood that he wasn't the one in control. He was just a man who had forgotten the weight of a single honest word. The bell above the door rang at 4:15 p.m., a lonely silver note that hung in the air longer than usual. Clara Bunch didn't look up immediately. She was focused on the rhythmic, grounding task of restocking the middle shelf, her hands moving with the practiced grace of a woman who had built her life out of the wreckage of another. She knew the weight of every person who walked through her door, but this footfall was different. It lacked the heavy, annexing gravity of a hawk. When she finally turned, the granite mask of her composure didn't crack, but her pulse slowed to a steady, wary drumbeat. Jeju stood in the doorway, but the untouchable architect of the syndicate was gone. The charcoal suit had been traded for a plain jacket and jeans that made him look like a shadow wandering through a world he no longer owned. There were no enforcers acting as punctuation behind his shoulders, no silver rings catching the light like industrial teeth. Even the dragon tattoo climbing his neck seemed subdued, a faded map of a war he was no longer interested in fighting. He stood there with the uncertain posture of a man who had never learned how to just enter a room without making it a tactical maneuver. He moved toward the counter with a slow, heavy patience, but this time he didn't lean over it to invade her space. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes, once like frozen glass, now holding a raw, cutting exhaustion that told her he had spent the last week replaying the truth in his head. The silence between them wasn't a cage anymore. It was a bridge. He looked at the hand-lettered price tags and the leaning shelves, seeing the fortress she had built out of silence and survival, and for the first time he didn't look through her. "Just a coffee," he said, his voice a low rasp that lacked the weaponized edge of the Jeju dialect. It was a simple request, stripped of command, a debt payment offered in the only currency he had left, honesty. Clara set her cloth down slowly, her steady gaze locking onto his. She didn't offer a grand apology or a smirk of victory. She simply reached for a clean cup. In the quiet shop that smelled of sesame oil and the cold necessity of starting over, Jeju sat on the stool in the back, a man who had everything, finally realizing he was just a person looking for a safe place to land. The steam from the coffee rose like a quiet prayer between them, blurring the hard lines of a man who had forgotten how to exist without a weapon in his hand. Clara Bunch didn't offer him the sharp edge of her resentment or the cold comfort of a moral high ground. Instead, she handed him the cup with the same steady, unshakable dignity she offered to the elderly woman who came in every morning for banana milk. It was a clinical, mercy-filled precision that saw the man, not the reputation he had used as a shroud. She didn't ask for his penance or his explanations. She simply gave him a place to sit where the air didn't feel like a threat. Jay sat in the narrow back corner, his hands wrapped around the ceramic as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. He watched her move through the shop, restocking the seaweed, wiping the counters, greeting the neighborhood regulars with a voice that held the weight of a life lived in the light of truth. There was no performative kindness, no pity in her movements, only the raw, forensic patience of a woman who knew that survival was a slow, quiet victory. She treated his presence not as a conquest, but as a simple fact of the afternoon, stripping him of the need to perform his power. By refusing to judge the wolf who had walked into her sanctuary, Clara taught him a lesson that no syndicate boardroom ever could. She showed him that true authority wasn't found in the ability to humiliate, but in the strength to remain human when the world wants you to be a monster. Every ordinary act, the restocking of a shelf, the ringing of a register, became a tactical instruction in compassion without judgment. Jay watched her, the silence in the shop finally feeling less like a cage and more like a room to breathe. He began to understand that the woman he had dismissed as invisible was the only one who truly knew how to stand her ground. In the quiet space that smelled of sesame oil and survival, the untouchable boss finally learned that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has already made their peace with the truth. The seasons bled into one another, and the cold, airless vacuum that had once defined the shop began to exhale. The amber glow of the single overhead lamp, once a dim shroud for secrets, now seemed to pull a genuine warmth from the brick and wood. In this sanctuary that smelled of sesame oil and survival, the rough edges of a raptor had been worn smooth by the forensic patience of a woman who refused to see him as a monster. Jeju became a fixture of the late afternoon silence, no longer a man annexing space with a black suit and a dragon tattoo, but a person sitting on a stool near the back. He learned to support Clara's fortress without the heavy industrial weight of his corporate syndicate. There were no grand gestures or performative apologies, only quiet, tactical moves that respected her obscurity. He began to listen to the rhythmic clink of the register and the third floorboards creak not as data points, but as the heartbeat of a life built one unremarkable day at a time. When he finally laughed, a low, sharp and real sound, it wasn't the performative bark of a man weaponizing language, but the relief of someone who had finally found room to breathe. In the brightening café, Jay saw Clara not as a useless shopkeeper, but as a commander of her own landscape, a woman whose hidden strength had taught him how to be human again. He watched her move with a steady, unshakable dignity, and in that quiet space, he realized that redemption isn't found in power, but in the willingness to be underestimated. The past still existed, a paper trail of ash and fabricated evidence, but in the warmth of the shop, it no longer held the power to define them. Clara smiled more freely now, her porcelain mask replaced by a piece she had fought a war to earn, as the man who once came to trap her became the one who quietly stood guard over her dreams. The sun hung low over the city, casting long amber shadows through the windows of the grocery store, but the air inside no longer felt cold or wrong. Clara Bunch stood behind the wooden counter, the same one that had once smelled of sesame oil and survival, now simply smelling of fresh coffee and a day's work well done. Jeju sat on the stool in the back, his frame relaxed in a way that would have been impossible for the man who first annexed this space in a pressed black suit. The dragon tattoo on his neck was still there, but it was no longer a weapon or a warning. It was just a part of a man who had finally learned to own a room without trying to crush it. I spent my whole life thinking language was a trap, Jay said, his voice a low, steady rasp that carried none of the sharp, weaponized edge of the Jeju dialect he once used as a blade. He looked at the hand-lettered price tags in the shelves that still leaned slightly to the left, seeing the fortress Clara had built not out of fear, but out of an unshakable dignity. Clara set her cloth down, her hands flat on the surface, the same surface where Jay's smirk had once dissolved into shock. She didn't look at him as a boss or a vulture, but as a person who had survived his own internal war. The trap wasn't the language, Jay, she said gently, her soft Korean voice filling the quiet air with a truth that had taken 3 years of invisibility to forge. It was the belief that power could protect you from being human. For the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like room to breathe, to speak, and to be seen without judgment. Jay nodded slowly. A debt payment finally settled in full, not with a rare book or a bribe, but with the simple, quiet reality of his presence. He stood up, no longer a syndicate boss hiding behind a reputation, but a man who understood that true understanding goes beyond the syllables we choose. Clara watched him walk toward the door, the third floorboard creaking beneath his feet, a sound she knew by heart in a shop she finally called home. As the bell above the door rang one last time, she tied her apron and went back to work, a commander of her own peace in a world that finally knew her name.